My parents emptied my college fund for my brother's failed restaurant. Now they need saving from homelessness, and I'm expected to step up and be the good daughter. I found out the money was gone 3 weeks before my high school graduation. I'd been accepted to my dream school with a partial scholarship, and my parents had promised since I was a child that they'd saved enough to cover the rest. $62,000 in an account with my name on it. Money my grandparents had contributed to before they died. Money I'd added to every birthday and Christmas when relatives gave me checks. Money that was supposed to be my future. My mother sat me down at the kitchen table and explained that they'd had to make a difficult decision. My brother Keith, who was 28 at the time and had never held a job for more than a year, had a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. A friend was selling a restaurant space for cheap, and Keith had always dreamed of being a chef. He just needed some capital to get started. They'd used my college fund as an investment. They expected to pay it back within 2 years once the restaurant took off. I asked why nobody had discussed this with me. My mother said they didn't want to worry me during my senior year. They knew I'd understand because I'd always been the reasonable one. The mature one. The one who never caused problems like Keith did. She actually said that like it was a compliment. Like being responsible meant I deserved to have my future stolen. I asked what I was supposed to do about college. She said I could take out loans like everyone else. That it would teach me the value of hard work. That Keith had struggled his whole life and deserved this chance, while I'd always had things easy. I had things easy because I worked for them. Because I got good grades and stayed out of trouble and never asked my parents for anything extra. Keith had things hard because he dropped out of college twice, got fired from every job he had, and expected our parents to bail him out of every mess he created. But somehow I was the one who needed to learn about hard work. My father said nothing during the conversation. Just sat there staring at the table while my mother explained why my brother's dream was more important than my education. When I looked at him for support, he mumbled something about how family had to stick together during tough times. I took out loans, deferred my enrollment for a year so I could work and save money, went to community college first to reduce costs, then transferred to a state school instead of my dream university. Graduated with $53,000 in debt that I'm still paying off 8 years later. Keith's restaurant lasted 11 months. When the restaurant closed, he blamed the location, the economy, the customers who didn't appreciate his vision, everyone except himself. My parents lost their entire investment. The $62,000 from my college fund, plus another $40,000 they'd added from their retirement savings when Keith said he just needed a little more to turn things around. Over $100,000 gone because my brother wanted to play chef. They never apologized to me. Not once. My mother said it was unfortunate, but they couldn't have known it wouldn't work out. My father still said nothing. Keith moved back into their house and has been living there rent-free ever since. He's 36 now and works part-time at a grocery store. I moved across the country after college, got a job in marketing that slowly turned into a career, paid my own rent, my own bills, my own student loans, built a life with absolutely no help from the family that had promised to support me, and then chose my brother instead. I visited twice a year at most, kept conversations shallow, never stayed longer than a weekend. My parents complained that I was distant, that I'd changed, that I didn't value family anymore. I let them think whatever they wanted. Then last year, my father got sick. Nothing life-threatening, but he needed surgery and couldn't work for several months. My mother had already retired, and their savings were gone. The retirement fund they'd emptied for Keith's restaurant. The equity in their house they'd borrowed against to keep the restaurant afloat a few extra months. Gone, all of it. They called me on a Tuesday night. My mother did most of the talking while my father sat quietly in the background, just like he had 8 years ago when they told me my college fund was gone. She said they needed help with the mortgage, just for a few months until Dad could work again. She said they knew things had been strained, but they were still my parents and they needed me. I asked how much. She said $4,000 a month. I did the math. That was roughly the same as my student loan payment, which I'd been making every month for years because they'd stolen my education fund. I asked if Keith was contributing. She got quiet. He was living with them rent-free, working part-time, contributing nothing, and they were asking me, the one who'd been forced into debt because of him, to pay their mortgage. I said no. My mother started crying. I ended the call and sat on my couch staring at my phone. But 20 minutes passed while I tried to process what just happened. My mother's crying still played in my head like a broken record. $4,000 a month. The same amount I paid toward my student loans every single month. Loans that only existed because they took my college fund and gave it to Keith. The math was too perfect to be a coincidence. They wanted me to pay for their mistake twice. Once when they stole my future, and now again to save them from the consequences of that choice. My phone lit up with my mother's name. I let it ring until it went to voicemail. 3 minutes later, she called again. I watched the screen flash and did nothing. The third call came 10 minutes after that. I turned the phone face down on the coffee table and walked to the kitchen to make tea I didn't really want. When I came back, there were 3 new voicemails waiting. I played them on speaker while I sat cross-legged on the floor. The first message was my mother crying. Her voice broke between words as she begged me to reconsider, to think about what would happen to them if they lost the house. The second message had less crying and more anger. She said she couldn't believe I was abandoning them in their time of need. That family was supposed to help each other. That she never thought her own daughter would turn her back on her parents when they needed her most. The third message was pure accusation. I was selfish. I was cruel. I had changed into someone she didn't recognize. I cared more about money than my own family. She hoped I could live with myself when they ended up homeless. I deleted all 3 messages and put my phone on silent. The next morning at work, I sat through the team meeting without hearing a single word anyone said. My boss asked me a direct question about the marketing campaign I was supposed to present, and I just stared at her until someone else jumped in to answer. After the meeting, I went to my desk and opened the presentation file, but the slides blurred together. I kept thinking about my mother's voice accusing me of abandoning them, as if I was the one who had broken the family trust first. Nina found me during the coffee break staring into my cup like it might have answers. She sat down across from me at the small table in the break room and waited. Nina was good at waiting. She never pushed for information or filled silence with empty chatter. After a full minute, I started talking. I told her everything. 8 years of resentment poured out in the break room while other coworkers came and went around us. I told her about finding out my college fund was gone 3 weeks before graduation. About my mother explaining that Keith deserved this chance because he'd struggled while I'd always had things easy. About taking out loans and working 2 jobs and going to community college instead of my dream school. About Keith's restaurant failing after 11 months and my parents never apologizing. About Keith living rent-free for 8 years while I paid off debt that shouldn't exist. About the phone call last night asking for $4,000 a month while Keith contributed nothing. Nina listened to all of it without interrupting once. When I finally stopped talking, she leaned back in her chair and crossed her arms. Her face showed something between anger and disgust, but not at me. She looked at me for a long moment and then said exactly 7 words that made something click into place in my brain. So they want you to pay for their mistake twice? I felt something shift in my chest. That was exactly what they wanted. They'd already taken my college fund and destroyed my financial future once. Now they wanted me to hand over the same amount of money every month to fix the mess they'd made with that stolen money. They wanted me to pay for Keith's failed restaurant twice. Once with my education, and again with my current income. Nina told me about her husband, Greg. His family had done something similar years ago. They'd borrowed money from him over and over, always promising to pay it back, never following through. They'd guilt-tripped him with sick relatives and financial emergencies and family loyalty speeches. Greg had finally cut them off completely, because helping them was destroying his own life. His parents had figured out their problems once they realized he wasn't going to be their bank anymore. And they'd downsized their house and picked up part-time work, and somehow survived just fine without his money. Hearing that made me feel less alone. Less like the terrible daughter my mother was painting me as in those voicemails. That evening, my phone rang from a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. My father's voice came through weak and rough from the surgery. He didn't waste time on small talk. He said family helps family. He said they raised me better than this. He said they needed me, and I was turning my back on them when they had nowhere else to go. I asked him directly why Keith wasn't helping. Keith lived there rent-free. Keith had lived there rent-free for 8 years. Why wasn't Keith paying anything toward the mortgage he benefited from every single day? My father went quiet. I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line. The silence stretched for so long I thought he might have hung up. Then he mumbled something about Keith going through a tough time. Keith couldn't afford to contribute right now. Keith was struggling. Something snapped inside me. I asked when exactly Keith's tough time would end. He'd been going through a tough time for my entire life. He'd been struggling and sensitive and unable to handle responsibility for over a decade, while I'd been handling everything on my own. When would it be enough? When would Keith have to actually contribute instead of taking? My father's voice changed. He sounded hurt now instead of weak. He said I'd become hard, cold. I used to be such a sweet girl who cared about family. He didn't know what happened to that girl, but he missed her. I hung up without saying goodbye. I went to my bedroom and pulled a cardboard box from the top shelf of my closet. Inside were all my old college acceptance letters. I spread them across my bed and looked at each one. The scholarship offer from my dream school with their prestigious marketing program. The financial aid package that would have covered everything with my college fund. The acceptance letter I'd cried over when it arrived because I was so happy and proud. All of it gathering dust because my parents chose Keith's restaurant dream over my education. I grabbed my laptop and opened a spreadsheet. I started calculating the real cost of their decision. $53,000 in current student loan debt. I looked up the interest rate and payment schedule. Over the life of the loans, I'd pay back almost $78,000, $25,000 in pure interest, money going to banks instead of savings or retirement or a house down payment. Then I tried to calculate the career opportunities I'd missed by starting at community college instead of my dream university. The networking connections I didn't make, the internships I couldn't access, the jobs that wanted candidates from prestigious schools. How much had that cost me in salary over 8 years? Another 50,000? More? The number made my stomach turn. Their decision to steal my college fund had cost me over $100,000 in debt, interest, and lost opportunities. And now they wanted me to give them $4,000 every month on top of that. They wanted me to keep paying for Keith's failure forever. I closed the spreadsheet and stared at the numbers until they blurred. My phone sat on the desk next to my laptop, dark and silent. 2 days passed without another call from my parents, which felt like a small victory and also somehow worse. The silence meant they were regrouping, planning their next move, or maybe just waiting for me to crack under the guilt. When my phone finally rang on Thursday afternoon, I didn't recognize the number. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something made me answer. The voice on the other end was familiar in a distant way, like a song I hadn't heard in years. My aunt, my father's sister who lived 3 states away and sent birthday cards with $20 bills inside until I turned 18. We'd exchanged maybe 10 words total in the past year, all of them surface-level pleasantries at family gatherings I barely attended. She started with small talk about the weather and her garden, and how her cat had learned a new trick. I waited for the real reason she was calling, and it came exactly when I expected it to. Her voice shifted from casual to serious, like she was about to deliver bad news. She said she'd heard about my parents' situation. She said family loyalty mattered more than anything else in this world. She said my grandparents, her own parents, would be so disappointed in me right now if they could see how I was treating my mother and father in their time of need. I asked if she knew the whole story. She paused for just a second, then brushed it off as ancient history that I needed to get over. People make mistakes, she said. Parents do their best. Holding on to anger from years ago was unhealthy and petty. I told her I was still paying for that ancient history every single month, that my student loan payment was proof that the past wasn't actually past at all. She sighed like I was being difficult on purpose. She said I was holding grudges and being small-minded about money when my parents might lose everything. The guilt trip rolled out exactly like I knew it would. She asked if I'd be able to live with myself if my parents ended up homeless. She painted a picture of them living in their car or in some terrible shelter, all because their daughter refused to help when she had the means. The manipulation was so obvious it almost made me laugh, except I could feel it working anyway. That sick twist in my stomach that came from years of being told that being a good daughter meant sacrificing myself. I thanked her for calling and hung up before she could say anything else. I needed to talk to someone who actually understood, someone who'd been there when everything fell apart the first time. I called Selena, my friend from college who'd lived in the dorm room next to mine freshman year. She'd seen me come back from my shifts at the campus bookstore at 11 at night, exhausted and behind on reading for my morning classes. She'd heard me crying through the thin walls when the stress got too heavy, and I couldn't hold it together anymore. She answered on the second ring, and I barely got through explaining the situation before she started cursing. Selena reminded me of the nights I'd cried myself to sleep over the stress of working 2 jobs while taking a full course load. She remembered the time I'd skipped meals for 3 days because I'd had to choose between buying groceries and buying a textbook I needed for an exam. She said my parents had 8 years to apologize or even just acknowledge what they'd done to me, and they'd chosen not to. Their current crisis didn't erase their past betrayal. Helping them now wouldn't suddenly make them appreciate what they'd taken from me. It would just teach them that crying and guilt trips worked, that they could keep using me whenever they needed money. We talked for over an hour. By the time I hung up, I felt steadier. Less like I was drowning in guilt, and more like I had solid ground under my feet. But that feeling didn't last long. The Facebook messages started coming in over the weekend. Extended family members I barely knew, people I'd met maybe twice at weddings or funerals, all sending variations of the same message. They'd heard about my poor parents and their financial troubles. They hoped I was doing the right thing and helping them. They knew I was successful and living far away. Surely I could spare something for family. Someone had clearly been spreading their version of events through the family network, painting me as the selfish daughter who'd abandoned her struggling parents. I deleted the first few messages without responding. Then I stopped checking Facebook altogether. But Monday morning brought something I couldn't ignore. A message from my cousin, one of the few family members I actually liked and stayed in touch with. She said she needed to tell me something and I wasn't going to like it. Keith had just bought a new gaming console. She'd seen him posting about it on Instagram, showing off the expensive setup he'd bought. He'd also been posting photos of his takeout meals from nice restaurants and tickets to concerts. He was spending his grocery store money on himself instead of contributing anything to the household, living like someone without a care in the world while our parents faced losing their house. I looked up Keith's social media for the first time in months. Every post from the past few weeks showed exactly what my cousin had described. Photos of new video games still in their packaging, pictures of fancy burgers and craft beer from trendy restaurants, screenshots of concert tickets for shows that cost $50 minimum. He'd posted a photo of his new gaming setup 3 days ago with a caption about treating himself. 3 days ago. right around the time my parents had called me begging for mortgage money. I stared at the photos until my vision went blurry. Keith was living in their house for free, eating their food, using their electricity and water, and spending every dollar he earned on himself. Meanwhile, my parents were asking me, the daughter they'd forced into debt, to cover their mortgage. The daughter who'd worked 2 jobs through college while Keith played chef with my education fund. The daughter who'd built a stable life without any help from them while Keith had been carried for 8 years straight. Monday morning, I walked into the office and couldn't focus on anything. The client presentation I'd been preparing for weeks felt impossible. I'd practiced it a dozen times, knew every slide by heart, but standing in front of the conference room, I lost my place. I stumbled over words I'd said perfectly in practice. I mixed up statistics and had to backtrack. I could see my boss watching me with concern while the clients exchanged glances. When the meeting ended, she asked to speak with me privately. I followed her back to her office, expecting a lecture about professionalism. Instead, she closed the door and asked if everything was okay. I tried to brush it off, but she kept looking at me with genuine concern, not judgment. So I told her everything. The college fund theft, Keith's failed restaurant, my parents' current crisis, the family pressure campaign. I explained it all in one long rush of words, expecting her to tell me to leave my personal problems at home. She didn't. She leaned back in her chair and told me about her own family. Her brother had addiction problems, and her parents kept enabling him, kept asking her for money to bail him out of whatever mess he'd created. She'd finally had to set hard boundaries and cut off the money supply completely. Her parents had been furious. They'd called her selfish and heartless. But protecting herself financially wasn't selfish, she said. It was survival. Sometimes the people who are supposed to love you will try to drown you to save themselves, and you have to choose whether to let them pull you under or swim away. She told me to take a few days off and get my head straight. I sat in her office nodding while she talked about employee wellness and mental health resources, but all I could think about was how I'd let my family drama bleed into the one thing that was completely mine. My career. The thing I'd built with zero help from anyone back home. The thing that proved I could succeed without their support or their stolen money. Walking back to my desk felt like moving through water. I grabbed my laptop and told Nina I was taking the rest of the week off. She squeezed my shoulder and said that was probably smart. I drove home in the middle of the day, which felt strange and wrong. The apartment was too quiet. I made coffee I didn't drink and stared at my phone, half expecting another call from my mother. Instead, I opened my laptop and started typing. Not an email, not a work document, just a list. Everything I'd done on my own since the day they told me my college fund was gone. Put myself through community college while working 40 hours a week at a bookstore. Transferred to state school with a partial scholarship I'd earned through my grades, not their help. Graduated with my marketing degree despite working 2 jobs the entire time. Moved across the country with everything I owned in my beat-up car. Found this apartment, furnished it piece by piece from thrift stores and clearance sales. Built my career from an entry-level position to senior marketing specialist. Paid my rent every month for 8 years without missing a single payment. Made my student loan payments every month, $53,000 that should never have existed. The list kept growing. Every accomplishment felt bigger when I saw it written out like this. Proof that I hadn't just survived without them. I'd actually done well. Meanwhile, Keith had been living in their house rent-free for those same 8 years. Working part-time, contributing nothing. Spending his grocery store money on video games and concerts while I paid down debt that existed because of him. My phone rang and my mother's name lit up the screen. I almost let it go to voicemail like I had been doing. But something about seeing my list of accomplishments made me feel stronger. I answered. She started crying immediately. Big, gasping sobs that sounded theatrical even over the phone. They were going to lose the house by the end of the month. They'd already missed 1 mortgage payment and the bank was sending threatening letters. My father's recovery was taking longer than expected, and they had no income and no savings and nowhere to turn. I waited until she finished and then asked the question I should have asked during the first call. Why could Keith afford new gaming consoles and concert tickets if things were so desperate? The crying stopped. She got quiet for a few seconds and then her voice changed, got defensive and sharp. I didn't understand how hard things were for him. He was sensitive. He struggled with depression. He needed those small pleasures to cope with how difficult his life had been. I felt something snap inside my chest. I told her I had depression too. When I was working 2 jobs and taking a full course load because they stole my college fund to fund his restaurant fantasy. When I was eating ramen for dinner 5 nights a week because I couldn't afford groceries and textbooks. When I was so exhausted I fell asleep in the library between shifts. But I didn't have the luxury of someone else carrying me through it. I had to function anyway because nobody was going to rescue me. The line went completely silent. Then my mother said I was being cruel. That I was throwing the past in her face when they needed help now. That she never expected her own daughter to be so heartless. I opened my mouth to respond, but she kept talking. My father's recovery wasn't going well. The stress of potentially losing the house was making everything worse. His blood pressure was up. He wasn't sleeping. The doctor said stress could cause serious complications. If something happened to him because of this, could I live with myself? Knowing I had the money to help, but chose not to. I ended the call. My hands were shaking so hard I almost dropped the phone. The anger and guilt mixed together in my stomach until I felt sick. I recognized what she was doing. The same manipulation they'd always used. The same pattern of making me responsible for their choices and their consequences. But recognizing it didn't make it stop working. I still felt the guilt eating at me, even though I knew it was manufactured. Nina texted me that evening asking if I wanted to come over for dinner. She said Greg was making his famous pasta and they had plenty. I almost said no because I didn't want to be around people. But then I realized that was exactly what my family wanted, for me to isolate and stew in guilt until I gave in. I said yes. Their house was warm and smelled like garlic and tomatoes when I arrived. Greg handed me a glass of wine and told me to sit down and relax. We ate dinner at their kitchen table and I tried to focus on the food and the conversation, instead of the phone call still replaying in my head. After dinner, Nina cleared the plates and Greg leaned back in his chair and looked at me with this knowing expression. He told me his family had done the same thing to him. His parents and his two brothers had treated him like an ATM for years. Every time there was a crisis, every time someone needed money, they called him because he had a good job and no kids and clearly didn't need all that money he was making. He'd helped at first, paid for his mother's car repair, covered his brother's rent when he got laid off, sent money for his father's medical bills, but it never stopped. Every time he helped, there was another crisis right behind it. Another emergency. Another desperate situation. His mother's health got worse and worse, always conveniently when they needed money. His brothers always had some tragedy that required immediate financial rescue. Greg said he finally realized they were using health scares and threats of homelessness to control him, to make him feel responsible for problems he didn't create. So he stopped, cut off the money completely. His family lost their minds, called him selfish and heartless and a terrible son, said if anything happened to his mother, it would be his fault. Nina reached over and took Greg's hand. She said his family eventually figured it out. Once they realized he wasn't going to be their backup plan anymore, they found other solutions. His parents downsized to a smaller house they could actually afford. His brothers got better jobs and learned to budget. They survived without him, which proved they could have done it all along. I drove home from Nina and Greg's house with their words sitting heavy in my head. The streetlights blurred past my car windows while I kept thinking about what Greg had said about his family eventually figuring things out. Would my parents really end up homeless if I didn't help? Or was that just another way to manipulate me into giving them money? They'd been making bad choices for years, always finding someone or something to bail them out. Maybe I was just the latest backup plan, and if I said no, they'd actually have to solve their own problems for once. The thought felt both freeing and terrifying at the same time. I spent most of the next day sitting at my kitchen table with my laptop open, researching options I'm sure my parents hadn't even considered. Smaller houses in their area were listed for half what they'd paid for their current place 30 years ago. I found apartments that would cost them a quarter of their mortgage payment. Keith could get a full-time job at literally any store or restaurant and make enough to cover rent if they charged him what he should have been paying all along. My father could apply for disability benefits since his surgery had complications. My mother was only 63 and healthy, plenty young enough to go back to work part-time if she wanted to. I made a list of every possible solution, and not a single one required me to drain my bank account or take on their debt. They had options. They just didn't want to use them, because those options required actual change and effort. Then I opened my own financial spreadsheet and looked at the numbers with completely clear eyes for the first time since my mother's call. If I gave them $4,000 every month, I'd have to stop making the extra payments on my student loans that were helping me pay them off faster. My emergency fund that I'd spent 3 years building would be gone in 6 months. The financial security I'd worked so hard to create, the stability I'd built entirely on my own with no help from anyone, would disappear. I'd be right back where I was 8 years ago, struggling and stressed and barely keeping my head above water. Except this time, it would be my choice, and that somehow made it worse. Wednesday afternoon, I was working from home when someone knocked on my apartment door. I wasn't expecting anyone and almost didn't answer, but the knocking continued, more insistent. I looked through the peephole and my stomach dropped. My parents were standing in the hallway. My mother looked terrible, her face pale and drawn with dark circles under her eyes like she hadn't slept in days. My father was leaning heavily on a cane, his shoulders hunched. They must have driven 10 hours to get here, and my father definitely shouldn't have been traveling this soon after his surgery. That's when I knew exactly how desperate they were. I opened the door, and they walked into my apartment without waiting for an invitation. My father lowered himself carefully onto my couch, wincing with every movement. My mother sat next to him, her purse clutched in her lap like a shield. We all just stared at each other for a long moment, and I realized this was the conversation we should have had 8 years ago. The one we'd been avoiding through distance and shallow holiday visits and pretending everything was fine when nothing was fine. I sat down in the chair across from them and started talking before my mother could launch into whatever guilt trip she'd prepared during the drive. I told them exactly what their choice had cost me. The $62,000 was just the beginning. I explained about the loans, the interest that kept adding up, the years of working 2 jobs while taking classes, the exhaustion and stress and constant worry about money. I talked about the career opportunities I'd missed because I'd started at community college instead of my dream school, the connections I didn't make, the internships I couldn't take because I had to work instead. My mother opened her mouth to interrupt with some justification, but I kept going. 8 years of silence was ending right now, and she was going to hear all of it. My father finally spoke up, his voice quiet and strained. He said they'd really believed the restaurant would work. They thought they were investing in Keith's future, that the restaurant would succeed, and they'd be able to pay me back with interest, maybe even more than they'd taken. He actually sounded like he was trying to understand why I was so upset, like this was the first time he'd really thought about it from my perspective. But his words just made me angrier, because they'd never once considered investing in my future the same way. I asked him directly why Keith's future was worth investing over $100,000 in, but my education wasn't worth the $62,000 they'd promised me since I was a child. Why did Keith's dream of being a chef deserve their money and their retirement savings and the equity in their house, but my dream of going to my top choice school didn't deserve the money that was literally already mine? My mother jumped in and said it wasn't the same thing at all. Keith had needed help, she said. He'd struggled his whole life, and this was his one chance. But I'd always been capable of handling things on my own, always been smart and responsible and able to figure things out. That's when everything clicked into place so clearly it almost hurt. They'd always seen my competence as a reason to give me less support instead of more. Being responsible and getting good grades and staying out of trouble didn't earn me their investment. It made me seem like I didn't need it. Meanwhile, Keith's constant failures and irresponsibility made him look like he deserved to be rescued over and over again. They'd punished me for being capable by taking away my support, and they'd rewarded him for being incapable by giving him everything. The pattern had been there my whole life, and I'd never seen it clearly until right now. My mother's phone rang in her purse, and she actually answered it right there in my living room. I heard Keith's voice through the speaker asking when they were coming home. He needed a ride to his friend's house and wanted to know if they'd be back soon. My mother promised they'd be home tomorrow and asked if he needed anything else. I watched this happen in real time. My parents sitting in my apartment begging me for money while my 36-year-old brother called asking for a ride like a teenager. The whole dynamic was so clear and so absurd it was almost funny. Almost. I turned back to them after my mother ended the call. Has Keith even been told you're about to lose the house? My mother's face went tight. She looked at my father, then back at me. We didn't want to burden him with this right now. I felt something snap inside me. You didn't want to burden him. The 36-year-old man living rent-free in your house doesn't need to know his parents are facing foreclosure. But I'm supposed to pay $4,000 a month to fix it? My father shifted in his seat, still recovering from surgery and looking worse than when they'd arrived. Keith is going through a difficult time emotionally. The stress wouldn't be good for him. I almost laughed. And what about my stress? What about the stress I went through working 2 jobs in college because you stole my education fund for his restaurant dream? Did that matter? My mother's eyes filled with tears again, but I kept going. I'm not giving you money, but I'll help you in other ways. I'll sit down with you and create a real budget. I'll help you research smaller houses if you need to downsize. I'll even be there when you tell Keith he needs to start contributing like an adult. But I'm not writing you a check. Her face changed. The tears dried up fast and her mouth pressed into a thin line. She'd wanted money, not actual help. Not solutions that required her to change anything or hold Keith accountable. She wanted me to make the problem disappear, so everything could stay exactly the same. My father leaned forward, his voice quiet but strained. What are we supposed to do if we can't make next month's payment? We've already missed one. The bank is sending letters. I looked at him, really looked at him, and said the exact words they'd said to me 8 years ago. Figure it out like everyone else does. The silence in my apartment was so thick I could feel it pressing against my skin. My mother stood up first, grabbing her purse with shaking hands. My father got up slower, wincing from the surgery pain. They walked to my door without another word. My mother was crying again by the time she reached the hallway, and my father followed her out in complete silence, just like always. I closed the door behind them and stood there for a long time. The guilt hit me in waves, but underneath it was something else. Something lighter. I'd finally said things that needed to be said for almost a decade. I'd stopped protecting them from the consequences of their own choices. That weekend, I made an appointment with a therapist. I found someone named Jasper who specialized in family issues and had an opening the following Tuesday. I couldn't keep carrying 8 years of anger while also being expected to rescue my parents from the mess they'd created. The weight of it was affecting my work, my sleep, everything. I needed professional help to sort through the tangle of guilt and rage and obligation that had been building since that conversation at the kitchen table before my high school graduation. My first session with Jasper happened in a small office with plants on every surface and soft lighting that was probably supposed to be calming. I told him everything: the college fund, the restaurant, the debt, the phone call, my parents showing up at my apartment. He listened without interrupting, taking notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, he looked up at me. Your parents' financial crisis is the result of multiple bad decisions over many years, not one daughter's refusal to help. The words hit me harder than I expected. He kept going. They chose to empty retirement savings. They chose to borrow against the house. They chose to enable your brother's dependence for nearly a decade. These are patterns, not accidents. I nodded, feeling something loosen in my chest. Jasper leaned back in his chair. What are you afraid will happen if you don't help them? I thought about it. Really thought about it. I'm afraid they'll never forgive me. That I'll be the family villain forever. The selfish daughter who abandoned her parents when they needed her most. Jasper wrote something down. You've been the family scapegoat for years anyway, blamed for being distant while your brother is excused for being dependent. What's the actual difference? I didn't have an answer for that. That night, I started digging into my parents' financial situation using public records and information from my cousin who still lived in my hometown. What I found made my stomach turn. They'd refinanced the house 3 times over the past 15 years. Each time they'd pulled out equity. The mortgage was actually higher now than when they'd bought the place 30 years ago. Every refinance had reset the clock, extended the payments, pulled out cash that disappeared into Keith's failed ventures and their own poor planning. The full picture became clear in a way it hadn't before. This wasn't just about my college fund or the restaurant. My parents had been financially reckless for years, making choices based on emotion instead of reality. They'd bailed out Keith over and over, borrowed against their future over and over, and now they'd finally run out of assets to sell and children to squeeze. They'd burned through everything and wanted me to be the next fuel source. My cousin sent me a message 2 days later that made everything even clearer. Keith had been talking at family gatherings, telling people I was rich and selfish, that I made 6 figures and refused to help our struggling parents. The number was wrong and inflated. The context was completely missing. But it explained why aunts and uncles I barely knew were suddenly messaging me about family loyalty. Keith was running a smear campaign while living rent-free and buying new gaming equipment. I opened my laptop that night and started writing the email to my parents. Each sentence took careful thought because I wanted to be clear about boundaries without sounding cruel. I explained that I couldn't give them money directly, but I would pay for them to meet with a financial advisor who could review their situation and create a plan. I offered to help them research smaller houses if downsizing made sense, and I said I'd be willing to sit down with everyone, including Keith, to discuss how each family member could contribute to solving this problem. I read it 3 times before sending, making sure every word was exactly what I meant to say. The response came 2 days later from my mother. Her email was 8 paragraphs long, and none of them addressed anything I'd actually offered. She wrote about how hurt she felt, how she'd raised me to value family, how she never imagined her own daughter would abandon them when they needed her most. She said my father was getting worse from the stress, and that she couldn't sleep at night knowing I was comfortable in my life while they were losing everything. She ended by saying she hoped I could live with myself if something happened to them. I read it twice and felt my hands shaking, but I didn't respond right away. My father's email arrived the next morning. It was only 4 sentences long. He said he understood I was still angry about the college fund situation. He wrote that maybe they should have handled things differently back then. He said he knew I'd worked hard to build my life, and he didn't want to take that away from me. He ended by saying he hoped we could figure something out that worked for everyone. It wasn't an apology, not exactly, but it was more acknowledgement than I'd gotten in 8 years. I took a breath and wrote back to him. I thanked him for recognizing what happened in the past, and told him it meant something that he'd said it. I repeated my offers of help with the financial advisor and the downsizing research, and I said I was willing to help them find solutions, but I couldn't be the solution myself. I wrote that I loved them both, but I couldn't set myself on fire to keep them warm, especially when Keith was standing right there doing nothing while expecting everyone else to carry him. I hit send before I could second-guess the words. Then nothing happened. 2 weeks went by without a single message from either parent. No calls, no texts, no emails. The silence felt deliberate, like punishment for not giving them what they wanted. I had a therapy session with Jasper during the 2nd week, and I told him about the emails and the silence that followed. He leaned back in his chair and asked how the silence made me feel. I admitted it made me anxious, like I was waiting for the other shoe to drop. Jasper nodded and said that was exactly the point. He explained that my parents were using silence as a manipulation tool, trying to make me so uncomfortable that I'd reach out and give in to their demands. He said the silence was meant to punish me for setting boundaries, to make me feel guilty enough to break. We spent the rest of the session working on managing that guilt. on recognizing that their choice not to contact me was just another way of trying to control my behavior. My cousin sent me a message on day 16 of the silence. She said my parents had finally told Keith he needed to start paying rent and get a full-time job. Apparently, Keith had thrown a complete tantrum, yelling about how unfair it was and threatening to move out. My mother was devastated that her baby boy was upset with her, according to my cousin, and had spent 2 days crying about it. I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and sadness reading that message. Satisfaction that they were finally making Keith take some responsibility. Sadness that it had taken a financial crisis, and my refusal to bail them out before they'd do it. 3 days after my cousin's message, my father called. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. His voice sounded tired and defeated, but also slightly relieved. He told me they'd decided to sell the house and move to a smaller place. He said they'd been in denial about their situation for too long, and that my refusal to help had forced them to face reality. He didn't ask me for money this time, just told me what they'd decided. I offered again to help with the logistics, and this time he accepted. Over the next week, we had several phone calls where I helped them research real estate agents in their area, moving companies and smaller homes they could afford. I sent them links to condos and townhouses, helped them understand what their house might sell for, and walked them through the process of downsizing. The conversations felt different from any we'd had in years, more honest and practical. My father actually listened to my suggestions and asked real questions. My mother barely participated in any of the planning calls. When she did join, she was silent and cold. My father admitted during one call that she was angry with him for giving in to the move. I realized then what had been happening. My mother had wanted me to rescue them so they wouldn't have to change anything about their lives, so Keith could keep living rent-free and they could keep enabling him. My father was starting to see that change was going to happen whether they wanted it or not, that they'd run out of ways to avoid it. Keith did move out, going to stay with a friend who apparently had a spare room. My parents' house went on the market and sold within 3 weeks. They found a small 2-bedroom condo in a complex for people over 55, and the mortgage payment was less than half what they'd been paying. Suddenly, their financial crisis was solved without a single dollar from me. They'd had options all along. They just hadn't wanted to use them while they thought I might cave and become their safety net. The email from my mother arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks after they'd moved into the condo. The subject line said, "Update," and the message was 2 sentences long. They were settled in their new place and everything was fine. No thanks for the hours I'd spent researching agents and helping them plan the logistics. I read it twice, looking for something that wasn't there, some acknowledgement of my help or even a basic expression of gratitude. Nothing. Just cold information delivered like a weather report. I deleted it and went back to work, feeling that familiar mix of hurt and relief. My father called that evening while I was making dinner. His voice sounded different, lighter somehow, and he actually thanked me for helping them through the move. He admitted the downsizing was something they should have done years ago, that living in a house too big for them with payments they couldn't afford had been foolish. It was the closest he'd ever come to saying they'd made mistakes, and I had to sit down because my legs felt weak. We talked for 20 minutes about nothing important, just normal conversation without tension or manipulation, and when we hung up, I cried for reasons I couldn't fully explain. Jasper's office had become familiar over the past few months, the worn leather chair and the plant in the corner constants in a life that felt constantly shifting. I told him about my mother's cold email and my father's unexpected phone call, about feeling vindicated that they'd found solutions without my money, but also sad that it had taken a crisis to force any change. He leaned forward and said something that stuck with me. Both things could be true at the same time. I could be right about my boundaries and still feel sad about the family dysfunction that made those boundaries necessary. Making the right choice didn't mean it wouldn't hurt. I sat with that for a while, letting myself feel both the satisfaction and the grief, without trying to cancel one out with the other. The relief of being right and the pain of family wounds that might never fully heal existed together in my chest, and for the first time, I didn't try to push either feeling away. And 3 months after that initial phone call from my mother, I stood in my bathroom getting ready for work, and realized I felt different. Not happy exactly, but stable in a way I hadn't been in years. My emergency fund was intact, my student loan balance was going down instead of up, and my work performance reviews were strong again. I'd survived my family's disappointment without falling apart or giving in. The guilt still showed up sometimes, usually late at night when I couldn't sleep, but it didn't control me anymore. I'd learned I could feel guilty and still know I'd made the right choice, that their opinion of me didn't have to become my opinion of myself. My parents had found their own solutions once they realized I wasn't going to be their backup plan, which proved they'd had options all along. Keith was living with a friend and actually working full-time now, according to my cousin, forced into responsibility by circumstances instead of choice. The crisis had resolved itself without a single dollar from me, and I was still standing. My relationship with my parents looks different now than it did before the phone call. We talk maybe once a month, surface-level conversations about weather and work that don't go deeper than safe topics. My mother still hasn't thanked me for helping with the move and probably never will. Too proud or too angry to acknowledge that I was right about them having other options. My father sends occasional text messages, usually just checking in or sharing a photo of something random, and I respond, because those small connections feel genuine in a way our relationship never has before. I've accepted that I can't make them see what they took from me 8 years ago when they emptied my college fund. I can't make them understand the years of struggle and debt and lost opportunities their choice created, but I also don't have to keep paying for their mistakes, financially or emotionally. Some family wounds don't heal cleanly, the scar tissue thick and visible even years later. At least I'm not bleeding anymore while trying to bandage theirs, not sacrificing my own stability to prop up people who've never apologized for stealing my future. The distance between us is honest now, built on reality instead of obligation, and I'm okay with that.